So let's get started. Morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We have Allan McDougall today, who will be walking us through NIST Cybersecurity Framework. So just a little bit about Allan. He brings 25 years of military, public, and private sector security service, holding a master's degree in security management, in addition to several other security certifications. He has also co-authored 4 books in critical infrastructure protection and has been a guest speaker internationally at universities and professional associations. He currently holds several volunteer positions that focus on learning and capacity building in the asset protection and security domain. So we're in for a really good session today. Allan's very seasoned when it comes to the world of cybersecurity. So just a few housekeeping rules. For any questions that you might have, I would suggest putting them in the Q&A section so that they don't get lost in the chat bar and any other commentary that people might have in there. But if you do happen to put a question in there, I'll just keep an eye on that and try to flag it out to you, Allan. If you would like to ask a question rather than type it into the chat bar, please use your raise hand feature and I will unmute your mic and allow you to speak. We'll have sections where we'll pause for questions or maybe even take questions at the end as well. So you'll have that opportunity. Otherwise, let's get started. Allan, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it, and I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, so the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, this is an introductory and practical approach. So we're not going to be, going through a list of controls, which those of you who have read through the framework will probably be, sighing in relief. But we're looking at it from a bit more of a practical approach to using it. Okay, so the objectives. The first thing we want to do is make you really aware of what's actually in the framework, walk through sort of a foundational roadmap on how to implement it, and then discuss some real-world challenges and how they were resolved. Those are really the 3 pieces here. And the reason here is because most people who run into this framework run into it first time as a big Excel spreadsheet or as a document with tons and tons and tons of controls on it, and they go, how do I start this beastie? Other than basically just doing it like a checklist. Where do I start? How do I basically bring this into an organization? How do I implement it? How do I manage it? So we'll be taking much more of that kind of view. Engagement rules and workshop. Now, some quick things. There's about 50 slides. And the reason why there's only 50 slides here is because you need time to be able to ask questions, and you don't want to really be drinking from the fire hose. But at the same time, you still want to get some information on this. The different backgrounds and understanding, that's, I think, fairly obvious. This is a reasonably public forum that is being recorded. So if you have examples or if you have things that you sort of identified as potential problems, remember this isn't really the forum for giving away sensitive information. So just try to avoid naming names. You can still ask the question, obviously, but it's a difference between saying I've run into something where this didn't quite work right, as opposed to saying, company XYZ basically does all of this stuff wrong, and as a result, they're open to a cyber attack. Okay. And then really the last question, is there anybody here who is doing or joining us through their telephone? If you just sort of, put a quick indicator in the chat or something like that, just in terms of a yes. Okay. So what I will do is, because the phones are great, but what I'm going to be doing is when we get into some of the slides where the text might be a little small for it, I'll just do a quick synopsis as to what's on that slide, just because it might be a little small for it. Back in the days when we all did, watch these things on, 40-inch monitors and stuff like that, that was one thing. But, now with smartphones and things, 3 inches isn't really a huge screen size. So we'll just keep that into account. We've done sort of the quick introduction on this and all of that stuff, but it's actually 5. But anyways, the most important thing that I've really run into on this is take the time to listen. So because we're dealing with a framework, you're going to see ideas that come from lots of different places. The knowledge level of the person is one factor. The experience of a person is another factor, those kinds of things. But work the information, not the experience, not the person. Weigh the information on its own merits. So I bring that up because it's a very diverse field on this front. Okay, so anyways, down to the meat of this, because we can rattle on the administration too long. So what is it when we get right down to it? Okay, the reason why flexibility and risk-based are important here. The cybersecurity framework is just that. It is a framework. It is a guide. It doesn't tell you exactly how to do something. It guides you with respect to what to do. So it'll tell you something along the lines of you should have an access control policy, or you should have governance, or you should have these kinds of things. But it won't give you a template and say your governance should exactly read like this. So if you have a background sailing, or if you have a background in flying, or basically working in engineering, these are sort of along the lines of the procedural guides, as opposed to the very prescriptive guides on that front. The second thing is this is really a framework that is what you make of it. It could be a framework where you could do everything, but if you do everything mediocrely, then it'll give you a mediocre outcome. If you take the time to think about what you need to apply, then it has the potential to really cover off a number of bases. And this is one of the reasons why I say at the start, take the time to read through the whole thing, understand what it's trying to accomplish, but also learn about your organization before you get right into it. Okay, so when you look at the diagram on the right, there are essentially three main boxes, and that's the core. The core is essentially the framework itself. And if you go to the NIST Cybersecurity Framework webpage, which would be at www.nist.gov/thing cyber framework, then what you'll see is you'll see a core document. When you download the Excel spreadsheet on that, you'll see what I mean by saying, oh my gosh, this can become a little tedious if you're not careful. The second thing you'll see is something called implementation tiers. And those of you who have done things in line with the process management side, where you see the ad hoc, documented, repeatable, managed, optimized, so you see these in things like ISO 33020 to talk about the process maturity. The NIST Cybersecurity Framework has its own implementation tiers, and the four of them, the T1 partial, T2 risk informed, T3 repeatable, and T4 adaptive. That's really your second piece. And then you have guidance. Now, NIST, you need to understand, is part of the Department of Commerce in the United States. And like every other good federal government department, they have reams of guidance. So you have the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, you have implementation course, then you start getting into the actual guidance side, and then you have tons of material, both available online and also in PDF format, to basically walk you through the specific, what they call categories and subcategories that we'll get to later. Okay. So the security functions that we talk about here, this is where you see in the Cybersecurity Framework version 2, the governance, identify, protect, detect, respond, recover on these things. And what it does is it breaks those functions down into categories. Basically the organizational controls, for example, under governance, those kinds of things, and then subcategories. Now, you take that, you apply that. Yeah, sorry, CSF is Cybersecurity Framework. Okay, so anyways, you take that framework, and then there's a NIST basically risk management framework. And this is the SP 830 is the guide for it, and 37 gives you a little bit more control. And then the control guides basically link onto the 837 when you get right down to it. So when you look at the actual process for this, Your framework uses the cybersecurity framework, and you'll have a number of requirements. You'll conduct an initial assessment, but then when you do your risk management, you'll be using a different standard. That'll be the 837 and the 830. And that's basically where you can start picking up the control guides, which would be the 853. And the control guides are essentially just another series of explanations about how to do things like access control, auditing, awareness and training, systems integrity, and so on. I got it. Okay. Now, I guess for the folks at Digital Nova Scotia, I don't know if the links will be active here, but they're provided in the actual on the presentation. So hopefully they are. There's also a slide with the number of these in the back. But the first thing is, don't sweat the idea of having 300 odd controls and having to memorize all of these things. As a matter of fact, I usually tell people don't memorize them, know where to look for them. And the reason being is you know where to look for them. When they get updated and changed, you'll catch that. I find the people who try to memorize these things, yes, they're very quick and they look very sharp, but the problem is they can become out of date because they don't catch the changes. The National Online Informative References Program is one of the better sets of resources for it. That's why I look at it and I say, okay, take a look and basically bookmark this thing, because between the profiles, the other guidance in it, it becomes very useful in terms of helping you work through some of the more complex kind of things. So on the core side, okay. So now we're getting into the actual, the actual cybersecurity framework, or CSF itself. This is what I mean by you look at it and it becomes an Excel spreadsheet. So you have governance, that's your security function. One of your 6, the governance: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. Then you'll see organizational context, which is your GV.OC, where it'll say something like basically, the circumstance, the circumstances, the mission, the stakeholders, expectations, yada, yada, yada. And then you see the subcategories. And that is the organization mission is understood and informed cybersecurity risk management. Okay. That's the level of prescription that you're dealing with here. And it doesn't really go much before that. So it won't tell you basically how to turn around and link your mission statement to it. It just says that this has to happen somehow on that front. It will give you an implementation example, in terms of what it might look like. And I would put a cautionary in there that your organization when you look at the organization, you have to understand the organizational culture before you start really getting into the work on this. Now, there's a question from Lu Yang, basically talking about a lot of different cybersecurity frameworks. There are tons, and I think probably the best way to describe it is that cybersecurity doesn't actually have one overarching body. It has tons of overarching bodies, depending on where you are and what kind of work you're doing. So, I've looked at NIST because NIST is one of the broadest ones. Okay, so you can apply NIST into the nuclear regulatory industry. You can apply it into the maritime sector. You can apply it into a corporate network. You can apply it into control systems. And a whole pile of other different places. So that would be the reason why I chose it. What you will find over time is that NIST may be a good starting point for you, but what you may find is that, okay, we're dealing with a lot of operational technology, for example, so you might look at a different framework, or a framework that basically works in conjunction with it. But in terms of a broad base to start from, NIST is one of the larger ones. There's other ones that are put out by the British Standards Institute, but they're not widely accepted in Canada. Canada, because of our interlinked supply chains and because our markets and the way everything else is, we won't get into the politics of the day. That's not why we're here. But because of the interlinking of how North America works at so many different levels, NIST made sense as a good starting point. The other thing with NIST is if you end up doing work for the government of Canada, you'll run into a document called ITSG 33, which is essentially their information technology security guide, which, quite frankly, without making any sort of crazy comments, looks an awful lot like the NIST Cybersecurity Framework and the 853 Bravo. And that's done deliberately because, again, systems basically have to talk to each other. So I think, does that cover off your question, Luye? Okay, cool. And for anybody else, feel free to sort of jump in on this stuff. Again, we've left enough time with the slides to be able to, have questions along these lines. Okay, and again, these are the functions that we're talking about. People tend to communicate these as a cycle, but they're not actually a cycle. They're more of a system. So now the reason why governance is usually put at the middle is because in the old NIST Cybersecurity Framework 1, the other 5 security functions all had a governance subfunction. Okay, but what they decided was that there were so many people that weren't getting the governance right that they said, no, we're just going to make this its own function to emphasize it. And that's one of the big changes that happened between version 1 and version 2. So the governance basically has a piece that touches the identification, the protection, the detection, response, and the recovery on that front. Okay. Now, when we're breaking these functions down, for those who have an engineering background, you'll understand the big V that comes from requirement derivation, where you basically take something and you break it down into subcomponents, and eventually you break it down into singular requirements, and then when you meet those singular requirements, you can roll them back up. If you understand that process, then the categories and the subcategories make a lot of sense, because what you can do is you can turn around and you can take the subcategories and say, I've met all the subcategories associated with this one category. Therefore, I can assume that I've met all of the parts that they're talking about inside this category. So what ends up happening is if you look at the column under subcategory, which is the middle one, you can say that the GVOC 01, the organizational mission is understood and informed cybersecurity risk management. You say, yep, we do that. Cool. It gets a check mark or a green box or assigned to 1 or whatever you would do to indicate that that one's done. And then as you work through all of the GV.OC-01, 02, 03, 04, when those are all basically marked off, you can turn around and you can say, yeah, my organizational context is now covered, my GVOC. And then once your GVOC and all your other categories are covered, then you can say, yeah, I've covered all of the major issues associated with governance. The trap there is, again, if you use the list too closely, you may leave something out. So these cybersecurity frameworks are written for broad audiences, not specific companies. So you still have to use a little bit of judgment and say, okay, is there something here that's missing? And you'll know this when the hairs go up on the back of your neck more often than not. But you look at it and you say, look, in my organization, I think we could really use this as well. That's something that you would basically add into your risk assessment under the 830 and the 837. And you would turn around and you would basically say, yeah, the framework is great, but we also need to do this because we have something unique in our environment. So, for example, if you're doing cybersecurity with, let's say, vulnerable populations or populations that require a special kind of access, you may have a different set of requirements that you need to be meeting. or you may have to take different approaches in order to be effective. So you may want to add that into the governance in terms of saying, yeah, we should also have a check here, basically saying before we make a decision, we want to check to make sure that we don't have an undue impact on some of the people that we're dealing with. So those are the kinds of things that this framework may not address at the very granular level, in the category level, and you just have to keep an eye out for those. And you do that by learning about your organization first. Okay, so we've flogged the idea of the categories and subcategories making up the functions a bit here. You will also see, on a number of normative references on the right-hand side. These are incredibly useful in the context of two things. One, it'll give you some of the guidance to give you some of the context about what they're talking about. The second thing is it'll tell you how old it is. Some of these pieces of frameworks, you want to have a sense in terms of when they were last updated. And the normative references will give you an idea, because each one of these normative references has a document attached to it. And one of the first things you can do with that document is you can go back and you can take a look at it. And I picked up on this probably 5 years into my career, when somebody looked at me and said, oh yeah, well, we're doing, we basically need to do this because this standard says this. And I looked at the standard and I went back and I looked at it, and it was written in 1999, which, okay, at that point wasn't that far back, but it was even before Y2K. Everybody sort of Y2K was the big 1999 to 2000 rollover, where people thought planes were going to fall out of the sky and everything. But having a sense in terms of when these normative references were actually written becomes very important on that front. This will also be your first indicator in terms of what specific controls are actually tied to this. So what you might see is you might see something in terms of the governance organizational context 01, but then what you might see is you might see something along the lines of an AC1 or a PL1, like a planning one, basically listed. Those are things that come from the 853 Alpha and Bravo, which are the more specific controls on that front. Okay. Are there any questions about how the framework is sort of organized between the governance functions, the categories and subcategories, and then how they sort of relate to the, for lack of a better term, the ocean of other reference material? I'm just going to pause for like a 5-second count in case somebody's got some questions that they want to throw into the Q&A on that front. And if you find the framework to be a little daunting when you look at it the first time, for those of you that might just be starting out, like those people who have a couple of years experience on this, they look at a framework like this and go, yeah, okay, that's not that bad. These are things that as you get used to using them, you'll get a lot more comfortable with them. But it's something that comes with, taking the time to do it. Okay, yeah, so going back to Andrew Cox here. So the categories are basically explaining what needs to happen for security function. So when you look at let's say the GV.OC, what you're looking at is you're looking at what needs to happen, or the pieces of the governance security function under the framework. So the way you might look at this to divide to divide this is that the framework basically gives you the outcomes that you're looking for, but the 853 Alpha and Bravo, which are the control baselines, and they're how to assess them, and the actual catalogs in terms of different profiles. Those basically are, for lack of a better term, more the how to implement something, or how to implement something. Is that reasonably clear, Andrew? Okay, yeah, and again, it's sort of the difference between looking at it and saying, yep, we want to have two. Basically, you need 2 eggs for your pancakes, and then the 853 Bravo will go into great granular detail about the breaking of the eggs when it gets right down to it. Okay, implementation tiers. This really becomes the second piece. The implementation tiers basically serve 2 functions. Function number 1 is that it will turn around and it'll tell you where you are, but then it will also tell you basically your targets. Okay, so you're partial, you might be looking at risk, you're ad hoc and reactive. I'm just going to go through these a little bit for the folks on the phones so that they're not looking at it and going, yep, I've got 2 pixels worth of information here. But at the partial level, it's ad hoc, it's reactive on your risk management, your processes are informal, your governance is minimal, people are just doing whatever. And your supply chain security, basically, okay, you got suppliers and that's about it when you get down to it. Your next level, your tier 2 being risk informed, your risk will have some processes, but they might not be done consistently. Your procedures are repeatable, but they're not necessarily well integrated. You see this a lot when people have processes, but they're not really being used in an organization. Lots of artifacts, but they're not well implemented. Your governance management's aware of things, but they're not really engaged. They're engaged on the really, really important stuff in their minds, but otherwise, it's like, why are you bothering me with this? And then on the supply chain security, you might have some awareness. You might say some suppliers are better than others. Yeah, we know these guys have like an ISO certification or something like that. Repeatable, your risk is now defined and integrated into business. And this is where you start talking about things like enterprise risk management. Your processes are managed, measured, and improved. Measurement is a huge leap forward in the NIST context because you're moving away from these qualitative assessments where you have low, medium, and high, and you start getting into things like setting performance or key performance indicators, technical performance measures, and those kinds of things. There's a trap there in the sense that some things cannot be measured very accurately. When you wake up in the morning, are you happy? You can make a good guess. But basically saying I'm a 6 in terms of happiness. Post coffee I'm a 7.5. Doesn't really work, right? There's some things that are more suited towards a qualitative thing. There's a bit of an art to figuring that out. And probably the easiest trick on this is if you deal with things that are best explained in ranges, you may want to stick with a qualitative approach at the start and understand what those ranges are. So I've got 10 employees. What's my employee morale like? Okay, I can say 7.5, but again, that's meaningless unless I'm doing surveys and measuring it. But I can say 2/3 of the people seem reasonably happy, and that'll get you through the first bits. Now, there is actually a NIST standard about applying metrics. It becomes useful. The NIST 800, I believe it's 55, that basically talks about implementing measurable programs. Won't get into that too much here. It's a bit of a slog to get through, but it makes sense. But anyways, so on your repeatable side, you're getting into measured. You also have active management engagement. You've got people who are basically now sort of standing over and asking how things are going. You're starting to see reports and that kind of stuff. And on your supply chain, you're starting to see third-party, basically formal assessments of your third-party risks. Now, Canada came very close because we had legislation on the books. C-26 was basically there, and there's part 2 of that was basically dealing with critical cyber systems, which would have actually made it a legal requirement for certain sectors to have a good understanding of their third-party and cyber and supply chain risks. We all know what happened, and we won't again. I steer clear of politics. I don't get into that, but the supply chain security stuff is something you want to pay really close attention to, and this is where the NIST 800-161 would actually give you lots of guidance if you need that front. Then adaptive. Okay, this is where you're sort of getting into the neo matrix kind of the security management stuff. your risk, you're now predictive. You're no longer, just measuring events that are happening. You're now measuring the events, identifying factors, finding those factors in other environments and saying, yep, this is over here as well. On your procedures, they're threat aware, they adapt with your threats. This is where you might see, the playbooks basically coming in where your distributed denial of services or your ransomwares or your other things. Basically, those procedures morph in time with how the threats are basically going. The governance are seen as a strategic business enabler, which, quite frankly, somebody should yell bingo at this point because there's 3 buzzwords in there. But what you're doing now is you're talking about security as being part of the core of what makes a company work versus it being a cost center, is really what that's trying to say. And then on your supply chain security, it's sort of like your risk management. You're now proactively monitoring things. I can't. I'm not sure who the anonymous attendee is, but yeah, I guess if there's a way to basically handle that.
Yeah, we'll share the recording later on this afternoon.
Yeah. And again, when you get down to this, our third thing that comes with the maturity are what they call profiles. Now, a profile is basically taking the cybersecurity framework and now applying it into a context. So what you might see as an organizational profile, which is usually defined by, okay, to apply the cybersecurity risk framework into the oil and gas industry. We have a profile for that, or into the shipping industry, or into corporate cultures, or into companies with a lot of automation, or with operational technology, that kind of stuff. So the profiles you can think of as essentially tailoring documents. What they do is they help you sort of apply the framework by providing you with a bit of a template that sort of fits. So if we looked at banking, you have the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, then you might have a profile for banking that would apply across all of our major banks, because it's still pretty general. But then what you would do is, depending on what bank you worked in, you would say our organizational structure, culture, and infrastructure and threats look like this. So this is how we're going to basically tailor that. And that's really probably the first key takeaway in terms of applying this is look to the framework, look to the profiles next, then look to your organizational culture, and then start working, as opposed to just, grabbing a profile and say, yeah, we'll do all of one of these. And fortunately, these are all available online. And again, at the end of the presentation, there's a pile of reference links for those who want them. Okay. I have very few buttons, but when it gets right down to it, compliance does not equal security. Okay. Point that, there's too many people that basically grab a checklist and say, okay, I've done everything on this checklist, and therefore I'm secure. What you need to, a checklist will give you guidance in terms of things that you should consider, but ultimately security isn't a science, it's a social science. And the reason for that is, yes, we deal with systems, and systems are engineered so they could be, you can do a lot to, reduce the security risk in those. But we're also dealing with people. And people have a bad habit of changing their intentions or changing the way they think and stuff like that, and finding new avenues for doing things. So yeah, you have to be a little careful when you pick up things like the cybersecurity framework, not to apply it like a checklist. Look at it, understand the things that it's trying to cover, and then work from there. You can build out things to look at in terms of checklists for specific tasks later, but you don't want to fall into the trap of assuming that security basically is that. And again, just to reemphasize this, I'm going to give you a bit of an example here, which isn't cybersecurity. Everybody remembers those suspect package things that you see up in the mailrooms where, if you have bad addresses or misspelling or oily stains or, you that kind of stuff. It's like, this is a suspect package and, you probably should treat it carefully. Well, that worked for about 6 weeks. Then what happened is all of the bad guys basically said, if I'm really serious about getting a suspect package through, I should make sure that I don't have any of these. Go figure. It's the same thing on the cybersecurity side. These are publicly available standards, which means that if you take the checklist approach here and you just do what's in that standard, those entities or threat actors or whatever you'd like to call them also have access to the same checklist that you do on that part. And they will have basically looked at it and said, yeah, I don't necessarily need to go and break all of this because there's a hole here that I can try to work my way through. And probably one of the best examples of this is phishing emails when you get right down to it. I won't, there's some offhanded jokes about, you can't protect stupid in security. But, in a lot of cases, it's not stupidity, it's unawareness. And people, if you get an email that basically says, that looks legitimate and everything else, and that's just a badly formed link, and you basically say, yep, my email is good because it meets all of these criteria, then you have a fairly, I wouldn't say a high chance, but you've got a higher chance of basically falling prey to one of these kinds of traps. And now that they're getting into some really creative tools for building these kinds of phishing emails, whether that's for general phishing or spear phishing or whale phishing, then you have to be very cognizant of building up the awareness side and understanding that, okay, what is this box actually trying to accomplish? And this is where you get into that. What are you thinking about? So again, read through it. What is governance trying to accomplish? Well, it's trying to have an orderly, well-structured kind of way of approaching issues. So there's probably a few people going, when are we actually going to talk about how to implement this particular beastie? So I figured I better put this in here. Otherwise, somebody's going to reach through the computer screen and basically give me a bit of a slap and say, yep, you got to get on with this. But looking at the general process, when we get down to it, your first step, learn about your organization, mission, and focus. In the 25 plus years now, because I've lost count of how many years I've been doing it. I've been doing this since about, I actually started in this in 1987. So if somebody wants to do the math, well, great. But one of the biggest problems that happens in the cybersecurity world, or the IT security world, or any of the security worlds, is trying to relate what is it that security actually brings to the table. And the reason why that becomes a challenge is because people look at it, they grab the cybersecurity frameworks, and they grab these other frameworks and say, we have to adhere to this because it's a best practice. To the business executive, that means almost nothing. Okay, the business executive is looking at it and going, I'm trying to figure out how to bring in enough revenue to pay people, to keep the doors open, the lights on, and all that other stuff. So why do I need to comply with this? Is it going to shut the company down? Maybe, maybe not. You can't give me a straight answer, yada, yada, yada. If you learn about the organization, mission, and focus first, and you relate how security supports that, then you get into T2, what needs to be protected. There are certain things you're going to protect because of regulations and that kind of stuff. That's a given. But what is it about our business that basically I actually need to look at? And this is where you're working through the organizational context and governance, by the way, and it'll flow through some of the other functions. But if you're in the banking system, I pick on banking because they're big. But if you're in the banking system, confidentiality is obviously very important. You don't want everybody's finances and credit information basically being out on the internet, but also the integrity of your processes. People may have a bit of an issue if they open up their bank account and the numbers are wrong. That will definitely generate some email. Okay, and then the other side being availability. So you're answering those questions of, what is it in my organization that needs to be protected? Why is it important? Is it critical? And you can find documents like the NIST or the NIST Interagency Report 8179 to talk about criticality models if you feel inclined. But what you're looking at is what needs to be protected, and you're getting onto T3, which is now saying, why is it important? I need this to do it this way because I am trusting on, our adversaries not having access to our strategic plan. So you're into confidentiality. I need this to be a trusted process because people rely on this information to be not just timely, but also accurate. GPS information, for example. We've all heard the jokes about the guys who basically turn left into the lava field, which oddly enough is actually something we ran into up in the Yukon once. But having that accuracy and reliability of the information, or the availability of the service, a safety critical system that evacuates smoke in a subway system. You don't want to basically find out that it isn't actually going to work because the sensors aren't connected right. The first time you have a fire inside the subway and you're dealing with a bunch of smoke inhalation issues. So you're looking at the importance of that way. And you'll probably pick up that as you work through this process, the conversation you're going to have with that business executive is beginning to become a lot clearer in words that they understand. And it's important to understand their context on it because nobody started a company because they needed a place to put our network. Okay, our network is a tool that they use to help run their company on that front. Now, once you understand the importance of it, this is where we're beginning to shift into the NIST 830 and the 37s, understanding of the threats. Now, threats, any act or condition that could be basically lead to an adverse impact, that can be natural, inadvertent, deliberate, those kinds of things. Vulnerabilities, you can talk about in terms of, gaps, deficiencies, improperly applied kinds of controls, things that aren't being done right, things that are being done inconsistently, and that kind of stuff. And risks in this context we're really focusing on things where we're talking about impacts and likelihood, and what does that mean to the company? So if, you might lose $100,000 in one instance, or you can lose $10,000 10 times, and your losses to the company are the same. It's still $100,000 when you roll it all up, sort of thing. But your single loss expectancies and your annualized loss expectancies might be a little different. Once you understand what you're up against and what your challenges are, then you talk about mitigation strategies. Mitigation strategies are not controls. They're what kind of focus you're going to have when you're picking the controls that you want. So, and probably the easy way to explain this is when you're crossing the street. Okay. Downtown Halifax, my mitigation strategy for crossing the street is using a crosswalk and making sure there's no drivers within about 100 miles on this front. It's pure risk avoidance when you get right down to it. If there's, I'm not a terribly fast person, and the other side being, there's not enough bubble wrap in the world for what I get, dinged by whatever happens to be large and moving much faster than I am, doing that. So my mitigation strategy crossing the street is basically avoid the issue of how am I going to survive getting hit by whatever. Playing sports on the other side, because I used to play rugby. Yeah, whatever. You're going to take the odd hit, but I'm going to understand how to take a hit. I'm going to understand how to see the hit coming and how I'm going to position myself and all that other stuff. And you go from there. And at the end of the day, you always want to have your plan about, how am I going to pick myself up and sort of shake it off and get on with life? And this is where you get again into the protection, detection, response, recovery, more on the cycle side. Once you figured out what your strategy is, be it not being hit by bus or just rolling with the punch a little, then you can start looking at your specific actions, which is where the 853 Alpha and Bravo come into place. When you start looking at the specific controls. Inside those, you'll also find there's a whole pile of sub-guidance that NIST puts out. For example, on access control, there's a whole set of publications, the 863 for identity and authentication management, which will give you remarkably granular advice that should go through, but that's roughly how the trail goes through. So T1, you're looking at learning about your organization. T2, T3, you're talking about the cybersecurity framework. T4 to T5, you're beginning to talk about the 830 to 37. Then T6, you've basically cycled down onto the 50 and 50, the 53 Alpha Bravos, those kinds of things. Okay. So I'm just going to walk through this. Those of you who've heard of me know that I like the maritime side. I'm a bit of a boat nerd when it comes right down to it. So, you find pictures of offshore support vessels like this, and you sort of go, hey, that's a lot cooler than my canoe. But anyways, to recap, what we're looking at, the organization, mission, and focus. Our goal here is we want our systems to be seen as contributors to the organization's success. That's really the key takeaway when we look at that. Okay. When you look at the mission statement, I've put one in here from an old 2008 book. The role of transportation network is to move persons and goods from their intended point of departure to their intended destination, so they arrive on time in acceptable condition and reasonable cost. So, for example, with what happened at Pearson International Airport, they made it to their intended destination, but it wasn't really, the aircraft wasn't in the kind of configuration that you were sort of hoping for at a landing. Fortunately, everybody seems to have survived that, which is good. But from a mission statement kind of side, what happened there is the kind of thing you're not really looking to have happen. So, but the reason why this is important is because this will tell you your organization's criteria towards success. Okay, I pick them up at the right point. I'm taking them to the right destination. They're arriving on time. They're in okay condition, and I'm doing it for reasonable cost. So you can tease out the criteria for organizational success here. And then you would basically be saying, okay, what is it that my system contributes to determining the right piece of departure, right point of departure, and those kinds of things. Okay. When you look at the NIST Cybersecurity Framework, they've taken a process side. So you're going to see things like, and this will be more at the 853 in the implementation, you're going to see things about people, assets, spaces, information, and supporting services, your supply chains, and that kind of stuff. But you'll see things like personnel screening is actually a section in the 853, and they talk about different things like background checks. There will be things in terms of access control where they'll talk about separation of duties, those kinds of things. Under assets, you'll see a lot of things about inventories, uniquely identifying things in spaces. Okay, this gets a little bit small, but the importance is where you start bringing in confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And again, so each of those things that contributes in the process, am I protecting its confidentiality, its integrity, or its availability? There's some new ones that have been coming in terms of things like reliability and and stuff like that. But really, these three are really the foundations. Confidentiality. Has anybody not run into the CIA? Okay. Yeah. Sorry. The 800. Sorry. Going back to a question there. The 830 is the risk assessment guide. the 800, 35, 37, these are the risk management frameworks. So these are the things that come after when you've taken your framework and now you're looking at risk. This is the guidance that NIST basically has in terms of conducting risk assessments, to put it in context on that front. Okay. And again, okay, so does that cover off the question? Okay, yeah. The definitions for confidentiality, integrity, and availability are fairly straightforward. Confidentiality, only appropriately authorized and trusted entities have access. I don't put this into the context of privacy. Confidentiality and privacy in my world are two different things. We'll get into that a little bit in the implementation. Privacy is talking about personal information, that kind of stuff. Confidentiality, you're talking about a subject-object and authorization relationship. But anyways, we'll get into that in a bit. Integrity, essentially, there's no unauthorized, inappropriate deletions, modifications, or additions, and everything's handled through trustworthy processes, i.e. the process basically does one thing and it can't be manipulated. And then on the availability side, it's pretty self-explanatory. When you need it, it's there and it's usable to the extent that you need to use it. So basic radar station. Again, vote nerd, sorry. But radar at least is close to IT. If we look at this as a working example, why would we have radar on a ship, for example? If anybody wants to just sort of blurt it out or just dump it in the chat. What's the major thing we're looking at when we have a radar station? Yeah, basically we don't want to run into stuff. We've all heard the great joke on YouTube about the Fifth Fleet, that kind of stuff. Radar, radar has a secondary role in direction, navigation, and inertial services. Will basically give us more of the direction, but we'll stick right now with basically, for lack of a better term, we're detecting things that we don't want to run into or things that may pose a problem for us. So this picture here was actually taken when I was working out in the Gulf of Aden. And while you might not see it very well, but the little two sets of dots here are actually a bunch of little skiffs that turned out to, be pirates. Okay. And, so the big thing was, merchant shipping, well, decided to go around them. Why get into a dust stuff if you don't have to? But, we saw them on radar well before they got close enough to us. So, but, how do we measure success? Well, in that context, we saw them in enough time that we could actually do something about it without having to, put ourselves into, a silly situation. What do we need in order to do that? Well, the infrastructure here would be, fairly straightforward. Well, okay. Yeah, I'm going back a little bit. The information is complete. We see everything that's in front of us and we can trust it. We don't have, lots of sort of ghost images. What do we need for the infrastructure? Well, we need a display, we need antennas, we need processors. And we won't get into the whole details about, basically designing radar systems because that's not why we're here. But each one of these things obviously has a function. The display should be projecting what the system says needs to be projected. The antenna should be capturing signals. The processor should be basically taking the information and doing the things that we need to do, right? And that's really what we're talking about as we're sort of working through this. And again, to recycle, if you work through this process within the cybersecurity framework, you will be able to build the link necessary to go into the boardroom and answer the question, that remarkably important question that you're going to get hit by the executives of, so what? Okay, why do I need to be adherent with the NIST Cybersecurity Framework or this whatever IT framework you basically come into. So what? Like, why is this actually important to me? Why should I be committing resources, or the company should be committing resources? Why should we be burning, time and effort into dealing with this? So that's one of the core lessons that I've run into, at least over the couple of decades, that's not as well explained in the first iteration of the cybersecurity framework, but they've started to talk about it in the organizational context controls of the version 2. Okay. We went through, and I put the definitions up here again just to basically be sure, that people did, because we all have sort of different ways that people communicate these things, but these are the more formal definitions, I guess. But really what you talk about is a threat exploits a vulnerability in order to cause injury to an asset, which then basically results in losses that's communicated as risk. And if you sort of remember that structure, you understand how it breaks. So there may be threats out there, but if there's no vulnerability for them to exploit, you may have to watch for new ones. But your risk begins to fall off the table, right? At the same time, you may have a vulnerability, but there may not be any threat. If I've got let's say a standard for a server room on an Arctic station, do I need a guard hut? Like maybe if there's a population around, but so like some of these things, you don't have populations around for 100 kilometers. So what's a guard hut going to do unless you've got some people you really don't like? Sort of thing. Yeah. Now, oddly enough, if you just for Arctic awareness moment, the reason why you have fences around these things is because it gives the polar bear somewhere to scratch. And it's easier to fix the fence than it is to fix the shack that the system's in. But anyways, yeah, but it's the old joke. You understand your environmental context as well, not in the terms of climate change, but in terms of your operating environment, because that's if you don't have threats, the vulnerability is certainly less consequential to it. Now, that being said, just because it hasn't presented itself directly doesn't mean you don't have threats. You should probably look for it. And then if any of these pieces break, then your risk falls off the table. Hold on, please. Okay. We get to this point when we talk about the cybersecurity framework where we have to basically look at a context. Are you managing a system or are you designing it? Okay. And for those who get into cybersecurity in a big way or IT security in a big way, you could end up doing either of these things. So in managing systems, I used to manage a number of basically reasonably sensitive systems. They operated in the classified space. As a result, I had all sorts of things, like rule books and playbooks and stuff like that I had to follow to, not meet people who were socially less adjusted than I was. The context, however, changed when I started having to design systems. So when I started looking at designing the operational technology that was supporting the safety critical functions in a couple of subway systems, the cybersecurity framework was relevant, but I had to change the thinking a little bit. So in managing, I was looking at what risks are considered reasonable, the last couple of slides. But if you get into designing a system, you sort of have to let that fall by the wayside a little bit, and you begin to look at what can possibly go wrong versus what might go wrong or what could reasonably go wrong. You still maintain an awareness of reasonable, but when you're designing systems, especially as they become either safety critical or sensitivity critical, then you begin to look at stuff that might be covered more in the security system engineering, which is the NIST 800-160, basically volumes 1 and 2, where they look at it and they say, what could possibly go wrong, and what can you do in the design process to basically make that less possible? So in one network where we had issues with access control, or we had concerns about access control, we looked at it and we said, okay, for an outside third party that we may know some things about, we're going to require them to register their computer with us. We'll put a profile on it. We'll basically register what ports that they can use on a physical level. We'll record their media access code or their MAC address. And we'll basically, filter, they'll have to be part of basically a group that we can filter on that. And then, assigning their device and IP address, and then the other ports, we'd say they're only going to be able to basically connect to our network through this IP range. And we cut down on a whole ton of problems, because even before somebody tried to do the usual sort of, login, password, multi-factor authentication side, they couldn't just take their device and plug it into any outlet and, have their device connect to the network, not without flagging us if they were in the wrong spot. So in managing a system, you might take that approach. Okay, the cybersecurity, going into that context. There are those things that you can control where you can set requirements for, and then there are those things that you manage in terms of through your agreements. So designing a system on the cloud, I would say your first question would be, who owns that cloud, i.e. where it's located, and this is where you get into things like data sovereignty issues and that kind of stuff. But how is that cloud basically managed on that front? I wouldn't design a system on a public cloud. Well, actually, correction, that's too quick a statement. I would not design a sensitive system that I was holding close to my own organization on a public cloud. Not unless I could configure that public cloud so that I could be very restrictive with respect to what groups would be able to access my particular space on it. And I was able to basically set my own monitoring and detection parameters on it. And even then, what I may do is I may deliberately obfuscate or hide certain details of it and not put it in that space, but just have something sort of off cloud, if you want to call it that. So your publicly available clouds, I would say, it's definitely a buyer beware kind of thing. Like there are proprietary clouds. So for example, when you get into clouds where you get into things like platform as a service, or security as a service, or infrastructure as a service, one of those three, where you have more granular controls and you have a little bit more control over your space, which if you're getting into more sensitive systems. Okay, so if you're designing something where you're going to make it a publicly available app and you're going to give it away for free, a public cloud might be, whatever, who cares? If you're doing something like, let's say, centralizing everybody's healthcare records, and you don't want to give away the codes and security features that are protecting the personal information that's protected by legislation, you may want to be much more on a proprietary cloud, or a cloud which you're dealing through a very, very well managed contract with a trustworthy service provider. And part of that contract will be basically saying, data's ours, data can't be used for whatever, and then it's managed a certain way. Does that cover off the question? Yeah. If the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity has a resource base, and if you Google Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, and they have guidance, they're what they call information technology security guides, or ITSGs. And in some cases, they also have publications which are oddly enough called information technology security publications, and they all start with ITSP. But they actually have some guidance with respect to cloud security that might be able to sort of help on that front. Sorry. Okay, so anyways, sorry about that. Things. Then when you get down to controls, okay. Again, making sure that we're not covered into looking at these as prescriptive things. If you are looking at applying these things in profiles, this is where we get into the profiles again. You see the picture for the small business quick start guide. Okay. The quick start guide basically gets you up and running. It doesn't get you ready to basically deal with everything that you're possibly going to encounter in terms of threats and vulnerabilities. But it, for lack of a better term, it gets you off the runway and into the air. Staying up in the air is another problem. Okay, and this is where you get the other guidance. But if and I know for the folks on the phones, you won't be able to see this, but if on the second part of the page, it talks about the purpose. It's saying this guide provides small to medium-sized businesses, SMB specifically, those who have modest or no cybersecurity plans in place with considerations to kickstart their cybersecurity risk management strategy using the NIST Cybersecurity Framework 2.0. If you're just starting out in an organization, trust me, you want to know where that link is. When you get right down to it. Now, and then it's just really a matter of seeing if they have one of the guides there, and again that becomes your second sort of tier of reading through and getting your context right. Okay. Now, the unfortunate part with webinars is you can't hear people's foreheads hitting desks or things like that, or people leaping off of buses in frustration. Is everybody sort of in a good space right now in terms of sort of understanding what the NIST framework is, from, let's say, a structural point of view? Okay, cool. Yeah, there's only so many ways you want to really flog the horse before it gets upset at you. So there's a couple of structural things, though, that I've picked up when you're applying the cybersecurity framework, which will make things a little bit easier. The first one is really talking about people that confuse privacy with confidentiality. Now, even those people who are much more knowledgeable about cybersecurity than I am, and there's a few, it's a debate. But privacy is when we're really dealing with that context of personally identifiable information in the Privacy Act kind of context, the kind of thing. You're really talking about an information or a data. When you talk about confidentiality in the context of access control, you might be talking about accessing information, but you're really talking about a relation between four things, which are subjects, things asking for access, objects, the things they're trying to access, authorization, which are the rules that govern access, and processes, which are basically how well those rules are enforced. And so this could be something as simple as I can't give you a secret document unless you have both a need to know and a secret security clearance, or it could be something as simple as when you're configuring having one process access another process of this process is basically approved to interact with these resources on a computer, i.e. it can access this memory space sort of thing, or people who can go into different rooms and that kind of stuff. But again, if you get your head around that whole concept of confidentiality, might be much more in terms of the subject, object, authorization, and processes, it will save you a bit of grief when you start talking about things like system integrity, or in terms of some of the sort of finer details and higher profiles with the access control rules when you get into the 853 alpha, because you'll look at it and you'll say, oh no, this is just these computer resources are only accessible to these kinds of things. So unless these kinds of things can demonstrate that, they meet all these rules, then they shouldn't have access to them, if that makes sense. What's the first thing? The other thing is we've made a shift since the cybersecurity framework came out, which is we're now talking a lot more about resilient systems than we are talking about, castles. So the concept of the citadel up on the hill, basically, you can look at this in like a military context. The old way we looked at cybersecurity was build a citadel on top of the hill, lots of layers of defense, lots of big thick stone walls, yada yada yada. Today's modern space, you're dealing a lot more with things like special operations units and funny public agents that are basically going around and manipulating things, that kind of stuff. But the second side, when you're dealing with the cybersecurity framework, is you want to have a bit of an understanding of the attributes of what are considered resilient systems, and that's why these are up there. And the objectives basically being to understand, which is your situational awareness. That's what you're doing, what your threats are doing, what you're not doing, what your threats aren't doing, that kind of thing. Your ability to transform, which is your modification of business functions. And this is where you get into your governance and organizational context again. And then your ability to re-architect, which is really talking about your network infrastructure. And then the ones on the right, you're looking at preventing and avoiding being attacked, go figure. Maintaining realistic courses of action through your preparation, which is your plans, your capable people, your exercises. It's basically being ready for things. Your ability to continue, which is essentially your business continuity plans, and those kinds of things. You're maintaining the viability of your critical functions. Constraining things by limiting damage. And again, when you look at the 861, which is the Computer Incident Handling Guide, from NIST, it'll give you all sorts of guidance with respect to how the difference between constraining something, isolating something, and remediating something. But really, what you're doing is you're I've got a grip on this attack that's basically happened. I'm stopping it from spreading, and it's not going to cascade through the organization or my supply chains. Then you're reconstituting, which is everybody says we want to go back to the way it was. It doesn't quite work that way, at least not in a continuously improving. You should be reconstituting first to your best able, but then if you've got a learning management system, or not a learning management, basically a way of picking up how you messed up and doing things better, your reconstitution should actually get to best able at a first step, but then you want to learn from your mistakes and you want to actually reconstitute a little bit better. So why? Because you just don't want to be doing this, that going through that whole shindig, one more time later on. Okay. So for those of you who we're hoping to actually have something more than a description about the organization of Excel spreadsheets and NIST documentation, we'll get into the fun stuff finally. On that front, we still have a bit of time to be able to do it. Okay. So how do I, I've got this NIST Cybersecurity Framework. I've got this massive amount of information on, different ways of doing it, or different guidance and all that other stuff. Okay, how do I basically do this without giving myself an aneurysm? Or basically realizing that a 40-hour work week is something I'm going to be dreaming about in 20 years. Okay, so that's what we're going to focus on, is really looking at how do I look at applying all of this information into, we'll call it a real world setting, even though some people who like living in the logical space say, well, it's not really real world. It is real world, but we'll get into sort of the application. You're going to see on the slides some P's. Okay, and that's just basically to help keep it organized a little bit. But you start with governance. You're going to work through risk. Obviously, when you're looking at trying to keep bad things from happening to you, your protective controls basically happen. Then you're monitoring. You're building out your incident response side, and then you're building out your resilience and your adaptability. P3, P4, or sorry, P2 to P5 don't necessarily happen completely sequentially. You may want to have a basic understanding of your incident response right at the start. It might just not be as well refined. So, P2 to P5, just sort of look at it and say, okay, there may be some small things that I need to do that might seem a little out of sequence, but my main focus, really, follows through these 6 trails. Okay, so where do we start? Well, the reality of it all basically comes with somebody has to pay for all this stuff, which means at the end of the day, you're going to want to have some form of executive champion and their supporting stakeholders to basically be at the executive level to understand why cybersecurity is important to them. And again, this is where going through all of that stuff about understanding missions and infrastructure and how security can be contributing to the organization's success becomes important on that front. And again, the reason for this really is twofold. One is you want to be able to have some resources. And the resources here we're talking about, people, time, and for lack of a better term, dollars, so that you can go and do things. So that's really your first challenge that you have to do is you look at that. You can bring in things like regulatory compliance and things like that at this point. There are things that we have to do as a business, otherwise people go to jail. That's usually a fairly simple argument, especially if it's the executives that go to jail. But at the end of the day, you want to start by having good governance and having that sort of senior leadership buy-in when you get right down to it. And when you look at this, what you're going to do is you're going to say that my constraints, these might be my regulations, my certification requirements, agreements that I've made through contracting, my risk management, and my industry norms and best practices and those kinds of things, those will all basically become your high-level policies. And when I mean policies, we're talking statement of management intent. We're not talking the IT technical policies at this point. But those become your policies that basically provide you the authority to do what you need to do as you're setting up this program, and also give you sort of limits in terms of what your activities can basically be. So that's really your first piece. And again, your governance function on this point becomes your important security function at this point. So what's this beastie sort of look like? Well, first of all, don't name names. Why? Because people retire, they go fishing, they go on vacation or something else. Stick to positions. Okay. So you stick with the positions and you stick with the organizations. Oh, is anybody else having problems hearing?
I can hear you just fine.
Okay, yeah, okay, so yeah, there's just somebody in the Q&A was basically saying, okay, great, sorry. So what you would have is you stick with positions, so your executive leader, might be, well, I don't know, it could be the chief information, it could be the chief security officer, or it could be somebody else. Okay. Then what you're going to do is underneath that position, you're going to have the stakeholders identified and what their roles and responsibilities are and those things. Your resources, you're looking at it in terms of, who holds them, where do you have to go to get approval for them and those kinds of things. Okay. And this is really where you're getting into sort of, looking at, what am I building in terms of understanding and what steps am I taking? So you're building the understanding of how your system basically supports the organization, why it's important, and why it's worthy of having that, couple of minutes or whatever time at the executive table to look at these things. This is where you get into criticality. You have constraints, and those are your obligations that we need to meet. Engineers talk about constraints and they stop. Risk managers, though, will talk about constraints and restraints. And for those of you who really, like splitting hairs. A constraint is something you need to get external approval for. So, I have an ISO 27000 certification. Therefore, the accrediting body, if I'm going to make a change that's outside of that, I need to go to the accrediting body and get approval for it. That is a pain. That is not a short process. It usually involves reams of documentation and artifacts for the accrediting body to say something. Restraints, on the other hand, are usually tied to your risk management decisions, and they can be made internally. So you can find the person who is what they call the risk holder under the corporate governance side, and you can look at that person. You can say, I understand what you're trying to accomplish, but I can't accomplish it that way. Would you have any issues if I do it this way? Because I think that's meeting the intent of what you're trying to accomplish. And that risk holder, they can just basically turn around and say, yeah, I'm good with that. Send you whatever necessary documentation so you can document the variances for your next audits and all that other stuff. But you're off and running. It's the difference between basically a week's worth of work producing artifacts and a cup of coffee when you get right down to a lot of these conversations. And then really your steps, your key steps here are your roles and responsibilities. Who's the authority on it? But then you'll also get into what they call functional authority, the difference between line and functional authorities. So in governance, you want your line authorities, who can direct you to perform tasks, and your functional authorities are what positions basically tell me that I'm doing what I actually need to be doing properly. Okay, so you want to have those things basically described. Is everybody sort of comfortable with sort of what that looks like? And to be really frank, what this really turns into is having an understanding of what your framework wants to look like and that kind of thing, but then having a number of conversations around tables. There's nothing particularly Hollywood in this particular thing. It's a lot of conversations, basically trying to make sure that you've got things lined up the right kind of way. In your governance, when you look at it, you want two pieces. One is making sure that you delegate authority in such a way that if it's something that's not covered, the people who are doing things have the authority to act. Okay, so like if you have, let's say, an IT security playbook, but then you run into something that's not covered in it, part of your governance is you want to have some of the authority to act in terms of immediate actions, delegated so that they can do things that they need to do. And they're not just sort of sitting there trying to seek executive level approval to basically, deal with a security incident. And then the second piece of that is, at what point do they actually need to say, okay, we're holding the line here, but now we need to start talking about approval? So an example of this might be, we'll isolate a node of a network so that it can't interact with something, but we're not necessarily going to shut down all of the machines. The difference being is that, when you've isolated the node and you say, okay, the damage is contained inside of this space at one level, but by turning off the machines, what do you do with all of the people whose machines just shut down? Are they authorized to still collect a paycheck for that day and all that other stuff? Those are the kinds of questions that will usually follow behind that kind of activity. And this is the stuff you sort out essentially at the governance side. Okay. Once you've gotten through governance, okay, you need to figure out what the battle space looks like. What are the issues that I'm basically running into on these kinds of things? You'll have a fairly good sense. You'll have a bit of a sense of this, and you'll have built some of this in the governance in terms of who's responsible for identifying risk and how do you basically bring risk into operations. But your next piece is refining that to say, what risk am I at and what's my current state? So the first thing is you need to know what you have. That's, again, people, assets, spaces, your information holdings, and your supporting services. Again, we're not into Hollywood territory here. We're talking about things like inventories. what is the value of this particular piece of the puzzle, but also unique identifiers. Because ultimately, if you have to go into an investigation, you don't want to be investigating everybody on the third floor. You want to be, you might have to start there, but ultimately you want to start with a workstation or with a person on something like that. So things like the employee numbers of workstations, asset tag number, having these things uniquely identified in this particular framework becomes very important at the implementation level, because it allows you to narrow your focus so you're not, for lack of a better term, overwhelmed trying to figure out the one piece. Your risks, once you've got what you're protecting, what are the risks associated with that? And again, these are threats, these things that acts or conditions that can cause damage. What are they causing damage to? What are they exploiting? What are these things? But you're looking at it in terms of the inputs, like your people, your assets, facilities, information, supporting services at one level, but then also to how these things interreact or interrelate. Those are your two pieces. Once you've got that, you're going to find out your company does an awful lot of stuff to, maybe tangentially, deal with these kinds of risks. So you'll be working through by function. You're now into the identify, protect, detect, respond, recover, the other 5 functions. Looking at that, and what you're going to be doing is you're going to be, looking at this and basically saying, okay, what implementation tier am I at this point? Okay, so you've looked at the 830, which is your risk management framework, or the risk assessment guide. But then, you're looking at it and say, yeah, we've got some controls on this, but, basically it's a free-for-all. Or, we have, well-versed controls, or, well-established, well-practiced controls when you get right down to it. Okay. So your questions, identify your input. For each input, understand, you can do this almost in table form, where you have, 6 columns, confidentiality, basically ties with, let's say disclosure or unauthorized access. Your integrity might deal with, unauthorized modification, and your availability could be disruption/loss. If you need to sort of, organize things in, Excel tables, some people like doing that. Other people have other ways. But then looking at that, and when you look at the controls that are in place to prevent your DMLs, so your disclosure modifications and losses, then saying, okay, are they ad hoc? And again, you go to your tier 1 through tier 4 attributes. Are they ad hoc? Are they sort of inconsistently applied? Are they managed? Are they optimized? That kind of stuff when you get right down to it. But you're answering the questions. When you look at the understanding is what I need to protect and what issues am I addressing. And my outputs at this point are a lot of inventories and registers that identify that kit, identify why it's important, and then also identify, what factors are basically associated with the security functions around it. And again, those registers, they're not fun to put together at the start, but when you get audited on something, or when you're doing your later on with your vulnerability assessments, will essentially take what looks like a 2-week task and it cuts it in about half when you get right down to it. First rule of dealing with barbarian invasions is don't let them in. Okay, well, same thing with cyber stuff when you get right down to it. Okay, and again, when you look at it, the protective controls, again, we're talking about that subject-object relationship. So you're looking at it and you're saying, okay, only those subjects that are authorized and approved given access. And then you have your identity authentication management. If you need guidance on identity authentication management, the 863 has a whole ton of information on that kind of stuff. Much more granular detail than I think anybody ever really was hoping for, but it's there, and it provides a pretty good guide in terms of what level of assurance when you're dealing with how do I establish an identity, how do I authenticate that, and then it'll even get a little bit into what they call federation, which is how you basically accept somebody else's credentials when you get right down to it. And when we're talking about protective controls, we're starting to talk about stuff that we begin to recognize in terms of security stuff, our access control, our firewalls, things like encryption, things like our endpoint security on things, network segmentation and zoning and that kind of stuff when we get down to it. But our focus right now, if you needed to put it into a simple catchphrase, would be don't let bad stuff in. And by bad stuff, it's basically anything that cannot be proven as being good stuff. Yeah, we're sort of crusty that way, maybe. And again, what'll happen is as you understand the value of your assets, you'll understand the sensitivity. Sensitivity will lead to zoning. Zoning will basically result in boundaries, and boundaries are basically what leads to your access control when you look at it. Okay. When you get right down to it. And then as you look at zoning, obviously the principle of, you have the best protections and the most protections around your most sensitive things. And then that stuff that you don't care about, you can put a little bit further out. And the rigor of your controls later, as you get more and more sensitive, your rigor on your controls will become, more important. Yeah. And again, as Andrew's sort of pointing out, zero trust, quite frankly, the way the cybersecurity has gone out there from a threat environment perspective, zero trust in my mind right now is probably the way to go, because it's pretty hard. It's pretty hard now to basically say that any entity is completely trustworthy on that stuff. But at the end of the day, you want to have an understanding of your zoning, your layers of your protection, and what's inside those zones, and then your output at this point is essentially a mappable network when you get right down to it. That might start with things like what they call functional box diagrams, which are just describing what a function does. It'll include things like, okay, where does my information flow between different functions? What do I need to have relating? And that will gradually turn into sort of network architecture documentation and those kinds of things. But what you're doing now is you're beginning to understand how your network is organized and structured, so that you can apply things to it. There will be a small collective cheer because at slide 40 to 48, yes, the end is in sight. But when we get right down to it, it's not enough to keep the barbarians outside of the gate. You want to watch for barbarians who do get inside the gate. And this is where, P4 comes into play, which is monitoring. Monitoring isn't just basically, sort of a one-time deal. I actually break it down into these 6, where your monitoring may be the outside conditions. These are your changes to your threats and vulnerabilities. This is, having access to things like the CCTX, which is basically a threat group here in Canada that deals with exchanging threat information about what's going on out there. Yeah. Well, even the guard, unfortunately, the guard dog usually gets the sausage from the burglar, and then the guard dog is unfortunately the burglar's friend now because he got fed. But we won't talk about penetration and things. But that's why you always carry a couple of sausages on or a couple of hot dogs for your penetration tests. But anyways, you're monitoring your outside conditions, your threats and vulnerabilities. And you'll see some things like SANS has some really good resources. CCTX, which is more of a closed community, but you can apply to get into it, and they're pretty good as long as you can sort of show why you want to be there. The Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity has a number of programs that you can basically draw resources from and those kinds of things. Then you have the more common ones like the MITREs and the common vulnerabilities and exploits in the CVE databases and those kinds of things. And these are things that you'll build up over time. So, but your outside conditions, that's your monitoring there. Your supply chain and your external services. Your supply chain might be contributing a product to it, and your external services might be, some sort of contractual arrangement like a cloud provider. But you want to be watching these guys like hawks. Again, no names, no pack drill, but a certain community of very large gray floating ships south of the border ran into a problem with one of its programs because a country that they were in competition with bought one of their suppliers. But because that supplier had an agreement to basically have all of the technical details, for that group's work, all of the technical documents basically went to that competing country because of compromise in the supply chain. You could also look at, for example, a few years ago, you'll see a bit of a kerfuffle about a radio company that was bought by a Chinese company here in Canada that was going to supply radios to public safety. These are the levels that are things like, it's not just, people coming in to hack on things. Depending on who the adversary is, sometimes they'll just go and basically buy a whole company in order to enter into the supply chain and then get access to the supply chain that way. And that can be either to get information on one side or cause problems on the other side. Boundaries and attack surfaces are fairly straightforward. What are you running into? That's, again, keeping tabs on that is, I think, it's pretty self-explanatory. Are processes and services inside the system? Okay, so what we're talking about here is system integrity, i.e., great, I've got a castle and I've got a moat, but is anybody actually checking to make sure nobody filled the moat in? Or, basically, put an extra door in the castle that nobody talks about. Whether now in the IT speak, that could be something along the lines of maybe did somebody, install a device with an open wireless connection that people could connect to, or something to that effect. But at the end of the day, not only do I have new things happening to me, new processes basically popping up that I can't explain, but are any of my controls at risk of failure? And that could be something like a camera going offline on a CCTV system on the physical security side, or it could be something like, our audit function or our logging function on the network basically just went, kablooey. So we don't have logs for the next 2 hours while we try to fix it, or, something along those lines. Configuration is, I think, self-explanatory. Who's changing what and what authorization did they have to change it, and then obviously data and activity. And I would go with the rule of thumb of when you're monitoring, that which does not make sense needs to be verified so that it either makes sense or it's basically controlled. It's no longer an idea basically say we're only looking for the signatures of bad things. We now also have to look for anything that doesn't make sense because we don't necessarily know what the bad thing looks like at the start. Now, a former president of the United States, a guy by the name of Ronald Reagan, had a great statement of basically saying trust then verify. And when you look at monitoring, that's probably one of the best little pieces of advice you can get. Don't just monitor. You don't just accept the results of your monitoring. Hold periodic tests of things to basically make sure that what you're seeing in your monitoring actually makes sense. Okay, so this is where you get into things like exercises on vulnerabilities or penetration testing and that kind of stuff. Have these things basically built into your framework when you talk about monitoring. It'll cover off a lot of that particular function for detection on the detection and notification side when you talk about detection and response on that piece. And what this will look like for you is essentially you're going to have a baseline of basically what is my engineered solution and what is my normal operating environment. And then anything that doesn't fit into that for whatever reason sets off flares or raises flags or whatever the statement is. And then the next thing you're looking for is anybody trying to change any of the configurations or any of the controls that might open up something that allows an anomaly through. And a piece of guidance on this is, remember, attacks can happen very quickly, seconds, or the stages of attacks when you look at conceptualization, planning, preparation, execution, and then exploitation can be done over the course of years. You have to have an eye out for both. So when we look at monitoring, what we're looking at is our understanding, which is building the capacity to watch and analyze what's going on in our space. And this is really when you get into things like logged and recorded activities, it's about building the baselines that basically allows us to make the statement of, I can detect threats because anything that I have not explicitly authorized and accepted at the start is automatically suspect. And threats are a necessary part of anything that would be suspect at that point. So, you work through your threat detection that way. It's if it's suspect, it's a threat until it's resolved, basically. And then what you have is your baseline and your watch list is tied to your mappable networks. But then what you have is inside that mappable network, you now have an understanding of how it's behaving. So it really builds off your network topographies and all that other stuff from the last phase. So that you understand how the pieces come together, what's considered acceptable, what's normal behavior, and then that baseline, it'll change. It'll fluctuate depending on changes of threat infrastructure and operations. But by having that understanding of the baseline as well as your watch list as it's applied to your mappable network, then what you have is you have a much better ability to detect that things you don't want. Response. Okay, once you've detected how you respond it, that's fairly straightforward. This is where you're getting into your playbooks, generating risks. Sorry, your playbooks for different threats and events. And again, how many people, just in the back of your mind, when you see a plan, a lot of people, a lot of organizations like having these like 500-page plans. Is there anybody that thinks you can pick up a 500-page plan and implement it quickly? Quite frankly, when you get down to it, plans have to be written for the people who are implementing it. And when you get right down to it, when you're implementing these plans, as long as it's not the DeepSeek one. But anyways, when you're talking about the people that are implementing the plans, do not assume that they are well rested, happy, well caffeinated, or whatever beverage they happen to drink in the morning, coming up to work and all that other stuff. Assume that they're going to be, probably a little tired, trying to get their feet under them or get their head into the right kind of spacing. They're probably going to be a little bit stressed trying to deal with things, because that's what happens when people have to implement these kinds of plans. You're not dealing with normal situations. People are dealing with, oh crud, I need to go and do something. So when you start writing your response plans, keep that in mind. Simple, non-technical kind of stuff, so that people can pick it up and they can follow it through. They understand what your intentions are. They understand what you're hoping to achieve, and they understand the steps that they need to do in order to get there. The other reason why this is important is because no good emergency happens at 2:00 in the afternoon when all of your staff are in the building or tied in it remotely. Oddly enough, and I don't know why this happens, maybe there's a mathematician that can explain it, but at 2 a.m. on Saturday morning, when you've got the backup to the backup to the backup who's doing some very basic network maintenance on the system, because nobody in their right mind is actually on the system, they happen then too. So your plan also has to be written in the context of, don't leave a lot of assumptions, and write it essentially so that I don't want to say the least capable, but let's say the least experienced and trained person in the organization can look at it and say, okay, I can handle all of these points, but I also know when to get help. because that'll be the other stressor, which is basically when the person who's executing the plan basically goes, I need to reach out to either authority or technical capability, but it's 3 a.m. on Saturday morning. They're not going to be happy. Take that into account when you're writing it as well. It'll take a ton of stress off for those people when you get right down to it. And then finally, coordinate the living heck out of this. That's within your organization, but also within, in terms of your external supply chains, your external stakeholders and those kinds of people, because nobody likes uncertainty. So you want to basically be keeping that side up. So you'll have an incident response policy, which basically leads to the incident response plan. You'll have your technical playbooks. If you need guidance on this, the NIST SP 861 latest revisions available online. It's called Computer Incident Security Handling. And what you should have at the end of the day is you should have a corporate part of your incident response. And that's your legal, your HR, your supply chain, your communications, and all these other guys who are basically protecting the company and its brand at one level. And then you have your technical side, which is basically, for lack of a better term, keeping the ship from sinking at the network level. Then finally, what we get into is recovery. Okay. No word of a lie, but I will not mention the organization. I did a facility inspection where basically they put their backup recovery center one floor above their primary center. I sort of looked at them and said, why did you do it this way? And they said, well, because we had the available space. And I said, okay, so if you lose the building, you do realize you've lost your backup center. Well, it's the same thing when you're dealing with networks. If your entire network has been compromised and your backups are not basically protected, like they're not, let's say, offline, but also immutable is important here. Like i.e., things cannot get onto them and change them. You may find they're not much of a backup. Okay. So the offsite protected, you maintain control over any encryption on them. You maintain control over how they're stored. You maintain control over their disposal and all of that other stuff. But what you're really looking for is separating that if you do have an attack and they do manage to get around everything that you've worked so hard to put in place, and your network is now in a situation where you have to go back to your last sort of trusted recovery point and reconstitute things, you want to know that that backup that you're going to is not part of the stuff that's been potentially compromised. And that's data at one level, but it's also your systems and your configurations at another level. Okay. And these will be covered in things like your business resumption plan and your disaster recovery plan. Business resumption plans, by the way, get your business functions up and going. Disaster recoveries are really looking at more of an enterprise level. It's not just the business work that's happening. You're also talking about all the infrastructure. And what you're really looking at is essentially establishing a structure where you're maintaining your critical services. You restore things based on criticality. You're normalizing things. You're figuring out what just happened to you through investigation. And investigations are findings of facts. They're not there to point fingers. They're not there to basically say, so-and-so is bad. They are just there to basically find facts, build timelines, and understand what happens. So you can analyze and examine things so you can learn from it so it doesn't happen to you again. But how you handle the investigation, I should say, is probably one of the key bits in that. And ultimately, when you get right down to it, this is what leads to your tier 4, is because if you get that process, you can now get into adaptability at the end of the day. You're now learning from your mistakes or learning from new things that enter into your environment. You're now looking at implementing what would essentially be the sort of cybersecurity/IT security versions of the Plan, Do, Check, Act, kind of functions or things that are familiar to those with quality management sides. but this is no longer a step-by-step process, or sorry, this is no longer a static process. This is now a continuously evolving system when you get right down to it. And this is where you really have to be careful in terms of making sure you've done your governance right, to make sure that, again, going back to that executive support for when you need to, looking at ramping up some of the resources available, time, people, money, to be able to do this. Not front. And this is where in your governance, you now basically, you can add that section, which is your adaptive framework, which is saying, okay, I've been hit, but I've learned from what I've hit. I now know what I need to change to keep from being hit again. And this is how we're basically going to check to make sure we don't enter any new unforeseen risks when we make these changes. And then this becomes a new normal baseline. And that you sort of cycle through and go from there. I put this in terms of the resilient frameworks, again, just to situate it, because this is essentially where the cybersecurity framework is intending to lead people. And then, some of the key efforts are really sort of the attributes, the idea of coordinated protection. It's not just a matter of, one piece being relied on. You have whole piles of pieces, the sustained integrity, your privilege restriction. Hey, I was a big important security guy. I should have access to the system. Everything in the system, absolutely not. And neither should the CEO for that matter. Doesn't matter if he's a CEO. The CEO with an inadvertent error can tank your network just as easily as anybody else. Non-persistent, again, this is going into stuff like object reuse. The diversity of things is essentially making sure that you don't, allow single, sort of a single vulnerability to creep in across all infrastructure. Segmentation is obvious, deception, and I think, your analytic monitoring, and I think the rest of them are fairly straightforward. Go from there. And then again, if the presentation is available to people, who have managed to, sort of endure the last sort of, 1 hour and 12 minutes or so, it's available. There's a number of different links there to basically, sort of help, sort of people, locate some of these artifacts and some of these things so they can go into a little bit deeper. But hopefully that sort of gives a context of what the cybersecurity framework is how to basically, look at bringing it into being. And I think really the sort of last point on this is something that, for lack of a better term, you develop a mental muscle memory for. As you go through it many, many times. Yeah. Okay. So Liu Yang, basically, what I would do, sorry to finish off the thought on the other side, just before I derail it. This will hopefully give you a starting point, at least where you can pick up things and sort of look at. If I was asked to design and implement a cybersecurity of a project, what I would look at that point, if it was a complete end-to-end build, I would be using the NIST framework maybe at the control levels, but I would probably look at taking the NIST cybersecurity framework and then looking at the system security engineering frameworks. Specifically the NIST SP 800 160 volumes 1 and volume 2. And then what I would look at is I would look at the section on processes there, which will give you your supply chain arrangements, your technical, your project organizational, your technical projects, and then your technical processes as, sort of, for lack of a better term, the guideline through there. And the reason why I say that is because those processes are designed to line up with the engineering structures under things like ISO 15288, which is sort of the lifecycle management for engineering. So I would probably look at taking the NIST cybersecurity framework and implementing it through those two lenses. My own personal feeling is the NIST SP 800 160 volume 1 or revision 1 might be better than revision 2, to start with. But that might be the clearest way to describe that one, if that answers it. Does that cover that one off, Lou? Okay. No open questions. That means everybody's forehead hit the desk except for Lou's and Andrews. I'm going to refer that one back to the Digital Nova Scotia guys. I have no issues at my end. I don't know what the rules for Digital Nova Scotia are. I imagine if it's recorded, then you would probably have access to the slides since that would be part of the recording.
Yeah, so we'll send out the recording link later today. And if you're comfortable sending over a copy of the slides, I can send that along with the recording link, or they can obviously see the slides as well.
Yeah. I actually sent over a PDF version of the slides. And for those of you who wondered why I did that, it's not because I'm terribly paranoid that people might change things. It's because it's smaller. PowerPoints, when you put graphics on them, have a bad habit of exploding in terms of memory size, whereas PDFs seem to be a little bit more manageable. Plus, God only knows what version of PowerPoint I used. So, the PDFs are at least a little bit more of a common application. Were there any other questions? We've got 5 minutes, or basically this will give you time to run to cafeterias or run to restaurants or whatever before the lines form.
Yeah, I just see.
Okay, no, I'm not seeing anything. Which
Perfect.
No, either I was clearer than mud, which or basically there was a lot of information to basically go through there, but I think when you get right down to it, certainly, and well, now I don't know if people can get in touch with me through the Digital Nova Scotia rules as well, but I'm not hard to find. I'm on LinkedIn. I finally bent the rule and put myself into one social media platform. But I tend to be fairly approachable, which means if you run into things, certainly people have questions. The other side is there's a number of different associations that have started up in the Halifax region, if this is where you are. There's an ISC Squared chapter, which tends to focus on these kinds of things. A number of different other groups. And also keep your eye out. There's groups of people that have been around the field that are trying to set up a system for mentoring people who are coming into the system, for those that are younger at it. Because so keep an eye out for that stuff. Lots there to there. I don't think I actually sent my LinkedIn link, but yeah, let's see here.
I can always add it to the email too that I'll send out later.
Okay, sure. Yeah, put on the email sort of thing, and if people want to connect, that's fine. Sort of thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay,
well,
so
thank you all so much for joining. Thank you, Allan, for this great session. And yeah, like I said before, I'll send out the email. I can add your LinkedIn to there. So you guys are welcome to connect with him there. But yeah, the email will have the recording and the slides. Yeah.
Certainly. Okay, no, and certainly the other thing I will tend to ask is I'm under no illusions of being perfect. So like when you run into webinars and stuff like this, if you've got any feedback, please let the Digital Nova Scotia guys know so that they can pass it on to the next person that does these things, because this is how we sort of continuously make things better and more useful to people who are taking the time to go through them. So you probably see a feedback kind of questionnaire or something like that. Please feel free, be honest, be brutal. I've got thick skin, but this is how we make things better in the long run.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that'll be on the email there as well. Perfect.
Okay.
Well, thank you all again. Stay warm and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
For those out there, good luck.